Hi, welcome to Drinkosaurus, where we bring ancient recipes into the modern era. My name's Matt, I'm your host, let's get drinking. In this episode, we're going to talk about how you can take a classic recipe like the Manhattan and turn it into something new, modern, that you can make at home. When we're making our cocktail variant, we want to keep three things in mind: the alcohol content, the sweetness, and the complexity, and make sure that any of those aspects don't go too far in one direction or the other. Before we can get into any creations, let's make sure we understand the Manhattan template. The Manhattan is typically made with 2 parts rye, 1 part sweet vermouth, and a dash or two of bitters. You can look up how to make a Manhattan anywhere, but what we're gonna do is change around this recipe to make it a little bit more complex and add a little bit more sweetness to it for those folks who don't quite like a super spirit heavy cocktail. So already with the Manhattan template, there's tons of variants you can make by substituting the sweet vermouth with anything with similar character. However, for this recipe, we're going to substitute the sweet vermouth with Averna. Averna is an Italian liqueur in the amaro family, which basically just means it's bitter, it has some floral characteristics, and it adds a bit more sweetness and complexity than our sweet vermouth does. Putting this in place of our sweet vermouth is what's called a Black Manhattan. So now we have a Black Manhattan, which, just slightly different from the regular Manhattan, still lacks the complexity and the sweetness that we want out of this drink. So far, we haven't changed our ratios at all. We started with a 2-to-1 ratio, and we're still at a 2-to-1 ratio, except we substituted the sweet vermouth with the Averna. If these are the ingredients you have, I suggest trying to make a Black Manhattan. It's really delicious, but if you want to add some more complexity, we're going to add a new ingredient called Nocino. Similar to Averna, Nocino is a liqueur made in Italy. It's less bitter and more sweet because it's made with walnuts. So now we have 3 ingredients, and our initial 2-to-1 ratio won't quite work out because it only handles 2 ingredients. What we're going to do though is take that 1 part of the sweet vermouth, which is now the Averna, and split it into 2 pieces to make a 2 to 1/2 ratio. We're almost to the final product. However, we're going to take the Angostura bitters, which is typically in a Manhattan, and substitute it with something a bit more fitting for our ingredients, which is black walnut bitters, which fits in with the walnut taste from the Nocino. If you're not familiar with bitters, they're essentially cocktail seasoning, and this will just bring out the walnut flavor from the Nocino. We're now at the maximum ingredients that we'll be using for this cocktail, but just to make things consistent, let's take away the Angostura bitters because we are completely substituting it. You might notice there's still some sweet vermouth there. That's because we're going to keep it incorporated into the cocktail, which really messes up our ratios. Let's review what we have so far. We started with 2 parts rye to 1 part sweet vermouth. We substituted the sweet vermouth with Averna. We then split that part of Averna to 1/2 part Averna, 1/2 part Nocino. We're now introducing that sweet vermouth back in, so we're at 2 parts rye, 1 part sweet vermouth, 1/2 part Averna, 1/2 part Nocino. But there's still a little bit more tweaking to be made. Remember how at the beginning of the video, I talked about how we need to balance our alcohol content, sweetness, and complexity? We need to tweak this ratio a little bit more just to be mindful of those aspects. Here's the tweaking we need to do. There's too much sweet vermouth in that drink, so we're going to drop it from 1 part to 3/4 of a part. The reason I got this number is just from messing around with it and getting something that worked. Finally, this 2 parts rye is going to overpower the rest of our ingredients. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop it from 2 parts to 1 part. But that's going to make our alcohol content a little bit too low. However, we're going to be using a high proof rye, which will boost the alcohol content without overpowering the flavor. And I'm happy to say that that is the final ratio that we'll be using, and now it's time for us to make the drink. In order to get mixing, we'll need a mixing glass with some ice. This is going to be a drink that is stirred because there are no juices or syrups or anything like that, so no need to shake it. And to fit our ratios, we'll need a 1 ounce and 1/2 ounce measuring cup and also a 3/4 ounce measuring cup. We're going to start with our 1 part of rye. I'm going to be using Old Overholt. and it's 100 proof, which gives us our desired level of spirit. Usually I put a little extra, actually. A little extra credit. Next, we're going to add 3/4 part of vermouth, sweet vermouth. I'm going to be using Carpano Antica because it has a lot of character and it holds up well against the high proof rye. Next, we want to add our half parts of Averna and Nocino. These don't have to be added in this order, it really doesn't matter. So we have 1/2 ounce of Averna. Ooh. And a 1/2 ounce of Nocino. Nocino is probably the most difficult ingredient on this list to find, but keep in mind, this could be substituted with any other sort of sweet liqueur. Play around, have some fun. And finally, we want to put in our black walnut bitters. Usually I put in a dash or two, but it's really up to you to how much walnut flavor you want. And from here, we grab our bar spoon and give it a little mixy. You want to mix it for like 20 to 30 seconds just to cool it down enough and also to dilute it slightly. Don't do this. It's good. The last thing we have to do is garnish this drink. You could put a cherry in it to keep it in the spirit of the Manhattan. I, however, am going to use an orange peel just because I think the orange and walnut combination works well. I'm really bad at that, so I'm really impressed that it happened. So we're going to express the orange oils over, give it a little twisty, just kind of dump it in there. And we have a black truffle. Despite all the ingredients that we added to the Manhattan and the amount that we played with the ratio, the drink still tastes very similar to the Manhattan, given that we preserved the roots of having a strong part of rye and sweet vermouth. What's different in this drink is it has a sweeter character with the Nocino and a much more herbal complexity with the Averna. This drink is great if you're having people over and you like Manhattans and they think it's too spirit forward. This drink adds a little bit more sweetness, which is more appealing to a wider variety of palates. You first get the rye up front, and that kind of sets the stage for the rest of the ingredients. But once the rye subsides, you get the sweetness of the walnut and also the bitterness of the Averna in there. So it takes a kind of a one-note experience from the Manhattan and just gives it a lot more character and a lot more complexity and updates it into the modern era. So in this episode, we took a Manhattan and added a whole bunch of different twists to it. I didn't just come up with this from this video, it required a lot of experimenting, but I hope this gave you an insight on how you can take a classic recipe and take some of the ingredients you have at home and play around with it. Drinkosaurus is a production of Little Giant Monsters. If you would like to see what other projects we're working on, check us out at littlegiantmonsters.com. We're also on social media, so be sure to check our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter page. If you have any suggestions for videos or have a cocktail ingredient that you don't quite know what to do with, let me know in the comments and I'll try to work it into some of my future videos. Be sure to subscribe to Little Giant Monsters to keep updated with future Drinkosaurus videos and also other projects that Little Giant Monsters is working on. Have fun creating and drink responsibly. Be sure to check out the 2 other videos that are based off the classic cocktail templates, and they can be seen here and here.